Hi, this is Patrice Thatcher-Stephens. I'm the Program Coordinator for Child Development and Early Education at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. And I want to use this video clip to go over some fundamental concepts of child development and early education that we use in class after class at College of the Siskiyous. This video clip is about principles, practices, and standards. And I use those terms so often in so many classes that to me it just always makes sense. And I always know what I'm talking about. But I've come to realize over the years that other people don't know what I'm talking about a lot of the time. And it's not your fault. It's my fault. So I want to go over what I say in class and give some examples and encourage you always to text or email or Zoom with me if you need further clarification. Principles are the big ideas. Any profession has big ideas that those who work in that profession agree upon as the foundation of their work. Practices are what we actually do, and as with its principles, every profession has specific practices that we use in our professions. And standards are the laws or rules that people in those professions follow in order to make sure that they are living up to their big ideas, that they are using the practices which are best practices, and that they all have some fundamental agreement on what is acceptable and what isn't. Examples of principles: liberty and justice for all, drive safely, Black Lives Matter, developmentally appropriate practice. Okay, so if we look at each of those, there are specific practices that reflect these principles. And I think this is where we get into trouble sometimes, because practices can be very, very specific, like put this puzzle piece here, or very broad, like, oh, have fun and play in the classroom today. So sometimes practices are very specific. Sometimes practices are pretty broad and they almost seem like a principle. So let me give you an example. Liberty and justice for all. One practice in our culture that reflects the idea of liberty and justice for all, which is a principle of American democracy, is that if we are thought to have committed a crime, we are allowed to have, it is our right to have a jury of our peers to judge us. Okay, that's a practice, having a jury of our peers. A more specific practice would be that we don't force people who are poor or without representation to cop a plea, to make a plea deal and just say, oh yeah, sure, I did it, just I don't have time for a trial, I just, give me a sentence. So both of those things are practices. Jury of our peers is pretty broad. Not copying a plea is pretty specific. For example, drive safely. Drive safely. That's one of our big ideas, one of our principles. Practices include, pretty broad, we have traffic laws. That's really broad, but it's not a principle. Drive safely is the principle. Another practice that is much more specific is, that little piece of I-5 coming into Weed over the hill between Louis Road and the Weed campus, where the speed limit changes from 70 miles an hour to 65 miles an hour. Slowing down and going 65 miles an hour is an example of a practice also. It's much smaller than we have traffic laws. We have a specific traffic law. The speed limit there is 65 miles an hour. Yeah. Okay, another big idea, Black Lives Matter. It's a very broad idea. One practice that reflects this big idea is, once upon a time, we passed a civil rights law that has the Voting Rights Act as part of it. That was a practice, the passing of that law. Not the law itself, that's a standard or a law, but the work, the legislation, the work in all of the branches of government to pass that law was a practice. A very much more specific practice is Read March by John Lewis. the civil rights leader who just died. It's a graphic novel. It's great. And it is a practice in recognizing that Black Lives Matter. A much more specific practice is don't kill black kids walking home from 7-Eleven. That's a really specific practice. Don't kill people for no reason because you're scared of them because they don't look like you. Okay, another very broad principle is developmentally appropriate practice. It's a broad principle. It's something we talk a lot about in early education. A specific practice is that in our classrooms, we have child-sized furniture. We don't give little 3-year-olds great big, 9-year-old desks. We give them little small chairs because Maria Montessori told us to, and she was right. Okay, another practice is allow a 3-year-old to use a marker to make circles and their marks and to use it any way they want, as opposed to holding a 3-year-old's hand and making them write their name. That's developmentally appropriate practice. That's our practice. Okay, what is the last one? Okay, okay, standards. Standards are laws and rules. I think this is a place where we get confused too, because standards aren't always laws. Sometimes they're rules that only a certain select group of people have to follow. For example, there are Title 22 regulations that we use in early education. You've heard about those. Those don't apply to everybody, but they apply to those of us who are setting up early education programs or working in early education programs. It's a law for those of us who are working in early education programs. Then there is the NAEYC accreditation standards, which is a standard. It's not a law. It's something we agree to. It's a rule. So if a program is accredited, then they choose to follow those standards. It's not a law that we have to follow if we are going to run an early education program. So, for example, the standards that we have for the different principles that I'm talking about are liberty and justice for all. You've heard of the Miranda notifications that people have to have. You have the right to an attorney. You do not have to implicate yourself. Part of our notifications, it's a law that we have to do that in order to live up to that standard. Drive safely. The speed limits are laws that we have to follow that help us to live up to that principle. Black Lives Matter. I had a hard time with this one because we don't have a whole lot of laws that live up to that principle. What a good example would be the repeal of, remember, New York City had a stop and frisk law. They repealed that law because it discriminated against people of color in certain neighborhoods. Developmentally appropriate practice. There are very few laws, unfortunately, which say that we have to treat children in a developmentally appropriate kind of way. There are standards. The NAEYC guidelines that I talked about before, they include a standard that says group times need to be fewer than 10 minutes for children under 3. Did you know that's a accreditation standard? It's something that says in order to use best practice, follow this standard. Okay, I hope this helps. And like I said, please text me, call me, set up a Zoom meeting if I can help at all making things clearer, because it's just not going to go away. I'm going to keep talking about principle, practices, and standards, as are all the other instructors in early education at College of the Siskiyous. Thank you. Bye-bye.